was to Russia. The Scandinavian countries were
Forgotten events from the 60s, it was a time with lots of happening. There was the civil rights movement, protests, and a cultural revolution. People were upset about the Vietnam War, and the space race was on. Sadly, 4 influential leaders were assassinated: John Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy. All this craziness followed the quieter 1950s. By the early 1970s, the 50s felt like ancient history, more different than the 1990s or early 2000s seemed to us now. It was a decade full of forgotten stories that shaped our world today. Join us as we explore the 13 important events from the 1960s kids today don't know about. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was a military operation gone wrong in Cuba. A group called the Cuban Democratic Revolutionary Front, made up of Cuban exiles who opposed Fidel Castro's government, tried to invade the southwestern coast of Cuba. The United States government secretly supported and funded this operation.
And there needed to be some kind of a comprehensive plan.
The attempt happened during the Cold War, a tense period of conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. The roots of the conflict trace back to 1952 when the U.S.-backed dictator General Fulgencio Batista seized power in Cuba. In response, Fidel Castro led the 26th of July movement and successfully overthrew Batista in 1959. Castro then nationalized American businesses in Cuba. In retaliation, the U.S. planned to overthrow Castro, leading to the Bay of Pigs invasion. On April 17, 1961, around 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at Playa Girón in the Bay of Pigs. However, the invasion quickly failed, and the Cuban forces, led by Castro, defeated the invaders within 3 days. Initially involved in the plan, the U.S. government decided not to provide further support, resulting in the collapse of the invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion became a significant foreign policy failure for the U.S. It strengthened Castro's position in Cuba, widened the gap between the U.S. and Cuba, and increased Cuba's alignment with the Soviet Union. This event also set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, further escalating tensions between the superpowers. As the Bay of Pigs invasion crumbled in 1961, the failed attempt not only heightened tensions, but set the stage for a more dangerous event. What critical face-off unfolded during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962? The Cuban Missile Crisis, occurring in October 1962, marked a critical moment during the Cold War.
April 17, 1961.
Bringing the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. The tension escalated when the U.S. deployed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, prompting the Soviet Union to respond by placing nuclear missiles in Cuba. The crisis lasted 13 days and is considered the closest the Cold War came to a full-scale nuclear conflict. In the background, the U.S. had been involved in covert operations against Cuba, and the Soviets were concerned about Cuba aligning with China.
Khrushchev built a wall dividing the city.
In July 1962, Soviet Premier Khrushchev and Cuban Prime Minister Castro agreed to install nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter a potential invasion. The U.S. initially denied the presence of Soviet missiles, but later confirmed it when U-2 spy planes captured photographic evidence. President Kennedy, facing intense pressure, opted for a cautious approach, implementing a naval quarantine to prevent further missile shipments to Cuba.
requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
After tense negotiations, a public agreement was reached where the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba, and the Soviets agreed to dismantle their missiles in exchange for the U.S. removing its missiles from Turkey and Italy secretly. The crisis highlighted the need for direct communication between superpowers, leading to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline. Although a compromise was reached, it led to Khrushchev's embarrassment and eventual fall from power, impacting U.S.-Soviet relations and influencing subsequent nuclear arms agreements. The Freedom Riders were courageous individuals who fought against racial segregation in the southern United States during the 1960s. They aimed to challenge the Southern states' refusal to enforce Supreme Court decisions that declared segregated public buses unconstitutional.
And then we had 5 hours more to ride.
Despite court rulings like Morgan v. Virginia and Boynton v. Virginia, Southern states continued segregation, and the federal government did not take effective action. The Boynton decision outlawed racial segregation in restaurants and waiting rooms at terminals serving buses crossing state lines. However, this ruling was not enforced, and discriminatory laws persisted. The Freedom Riders, organized by groups like the Congress of Racial Equality and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, took a bold stand. They rode interstate buses in mixed racial groups, challenging local segregation laws and customs. The Freedom Rides gained attention by highlighting the South's disregard for federal law and the violent measures used to enforce segregation.
When is this invasion going to stop?
I think the invasion will continue.
Police often arrested the riders on various charges, and white mobs attacked them with minimal intervention. The actions of the Freedom Riders, which began in 1961, contributed significantly to the credibility of the American civil rights movement. Their efforts built on earlier protests, such as sit-ins at segregated lunch counters and boycotts of businesses supporting segregation. And despite facing arrests, violence, and collaboration between local police and groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the Freedom Riders persisted in their quest for equality. The Supreme Court's decision in Boynton ultimately supported the right of interstate travelers to ignore local segregation laws, marking a crucial step in the fight against racial discrimination in the United States. As the Freedom Riders challenged segregation in the 1960s, one wonders how their courageous actions intersected with broader issues. Now, considering the environmental awakening triggered by Silent Spring in 1962, how did societal shifts align with these environmental concerns? Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson and published in 1962, is a groundbreaking environmental science book that exposed the harmful effects of a pesticide widely used since World War II. Carson focused on the indiscriminate use of this pesticide, which was causing significant environmental damage. She accused the chemical industry of spreading misleading information and criticized public officials for unquestioningly accepting the industry's marketing claims.
To happen to them as a result of that exposure.
During the late 1950s, Rachel Carson delved into environmental conservation, particularly addressing issues she attributed to synthetic pesticides. The culmination of her research was Silent Spring, a work that brought environmental concerns to the forefront of American public awareness. Despite strong opposition from chemical companies, the book profoundly impacted public opinion. The consequences were notable.
Children born today are exposed to these chemicals from birth.
A shift in U.S. pesticide policy, a nationwide ban on the agricultural use of DDT, and the emergence of an environmental movement that eventually led to the establishment of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Carson's work triggered essential policy changes and ignited a broader awareness of ecological issues and their impact on public health. The significance of Silent Spring was recognized in 2006 when it was named one of the 25 greatest science books of all time by the editors of Discover magazine. As Silent Spring reveals the profound impact of environmental awareness, one can't help but question how societal shifts like the Birmingham Campaign in 1963 intersect with broader issues. The Birmingham Campaign was significant in the American Civil Rights Movement in 1963. It was organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, to address the racial segregation and discrimination faced by African Americans in Birmingham, Alabama. Led by prominent figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., James Bevel, and Fred Shuttlesworth, the campaign employed nonviolent direct action to bring attention to the unjust treatment of black citizens.
Sent me to work with Dr. King at SCLC.
Birmingham during the early 1960s was known for its severe racial divisions, both legally and culturally. Black residents encountered legal and economic disparities, as well as violent backlash when attempting to address their issues. The protests began with a boycott initiated by Shuttlesworth, aiming to pressure businesses to end racial discrimination in employment and public facilities. When local leaders resisted, the SCLC joined the efforts, implementing Project C, a series of sit-ins and marches led by students to provoke mass arrests.
There were already 400 or 500 people in jail.
James Bevel's idea to involve students as the primary demonstrators resulted in over 1,000 arrests. The Birmingham Police Department, under the direction of Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor, responded with high-pressure water hoses and police dogs against the peaceful student protesters. The media coverage brought global attention to racial segregation in the South, enhancing Martin Luther King Jr.'s reputation and leading to the removal of Bull Connor from his position. Ultimately, the Birmingham campaign played a crucial role in achieving desegregation in the city and laid the groundwork for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited racial discrimination in employment and public services across the United States.
It's awful to see.
Malcolm X, a well-known African-American leader during the Civil Rights Movement, was shot and killed in New York City on February 21, 1965, at the age of 39. He was preparing to speak at the Organization of Afro-American Unity when he was attacked at the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights. 3 members of the Nation of Islam, Muhammad Abdul Aziz, Khalil Islam, and Thomas Hagen, were initially convicted of his murder and received life sentences. However, in November 2021, Aziz and Islam were cleared of the charges. Malcolm X's assassination has been a subject of speculation for many years, with ongoing questions about whether other members of the Nation of Islam or law enforcement agencies were involved. This event was one of the significant assassinations in the 1960s, occurring between the assassinations of John F. Kennedy in 1963 and Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968.
What kind of hell you've been catching, and let him know that if he's not ready.
Malcolm X was a religious figure and a human rights activist who advocated for the rights and empowerment of African Americans. His death had a profound impact on the civil rights movement, leaving a void in the leadership and sparking ongoing discussions about the circumstances surrounding his assassination. As Malcolm X's assassination unveils layers of mystery and speculation, the unsettling events of 1965 echo into the Watts riots. What explosive tensions lie beneath the surface connecting these pivotal moments? The Watts riots, also known as the Watts Rebellion or Watts Uprising, occurred in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles from August 11 to 16, 1965.
There was a scuffle and a crowd gathered.
The unrest was sparked when 21-year-old African-American man Marquette Fry was pulled over for drunk driving on August 11, 1965. As he failed a sobriety test, police tried to arrest him, leading to a physical altercation where Marquette was struck in the face with a baton. A crowd gathered and rumors spread that the police had kicked a pregnant woman. This incident triggered 6 days of civil unrest, fueled partly by accusations of police brutality.
The burning and looting, the shooting and beating went on for...
The situation escalated, leading to widespread chaos. Nearly 14,000 California Army National Guard members were called to quell the disturbances. The aftermath of the riots included 34 deaths and over $40 million in property damage, making it the city's most severe unrest until the Rodney King riots in 1992. The Watts riots highlighted deep-seated issues of racial tension, police misconduct, and economic disparities in the community. The event symbolized frustration and anger within marginalized communities, sparking a larger conversation about social injustice. As the Watts riots exposed deep-rooted issues in 1965, sparking conversations on injustice, the Stonewall riots in 1969 marked a turning point for LGBTQ rights. The Stonewall riots, also known as the Stonewall Uprising, were a series of protests by the LGBTQ community in response to a police raid at the Stonewall Inn in New York City on June 28, 1969.
When I was 18 years old, I knew I was gay, but I didn't even know what the right word for it was.
The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar owned by the mafia, and police raids on such establishments were common at the time. However, this particular raid sparked a significant turning point. On that night, patrons of Stonewall and others in the LGBTQ community fought back against the police violence. This resistance led to more protests in the following days, marking a watershed moment in the gay liberation movement.
Being gay was the most terrible thing you could possibly be.
Activist groups quickly formed, demanding the right to live openly without fear of arrest based on sexual orientation. 3 newspapers were established to promote the rights of gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals. A year after the uprising, the first gay pride marches occurred in several cities, marking the anniversary on June 28, 1970. This event sparked the formation of gay rights organizations globally. Today, June is celebrated as LGBT Pride Month in honor of the Stonewall riots. In 2016, the Stonewall National Monument was established at the site, and in 2019, the New York City Police Commissioner formally apologized for officers' actions in 1969. The 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising was commemorated by an estimated 5 million participants, highlighting the enduring impact of this pivotal moment in the fight for LGBTQ rights. The Great Society was a plan in the United States started by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964 and 1965. He wanted to fix problems like poverty and unfair treatment based on race. Johnson discussed it during a speech in Ohio, 1964, then officially discussed it at the University of Michigan.
It reaches beyond the child to parents who may not understand their children's needs.
He wanted to make significant changes in civil rights, education, healthcare, city issues, poor areas in the countryside, and transportation. They made new programs to help with these problems. Johnson and other Democrats in Congress supported these plans during the 1960s. The Great Society was like the New Deal, a set of plans President Franklin D. Roosevelt made in the 1930s. Some ideas in the Great Society came from plans made before by President John F. Kennedy. Johnson's ability to convince people and the big win by the Democrats in the 1964 elections helped make the Great Society possible. But some Democrats who were against the Vietnam War said that money spent on the war took away from the Great Society. Even though some programs were stopped or got less money, many of them, like Medicare, Medicaid, and federal education help, are still around today. Even after Johnson, Republican presidents like Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford kept expanding the Great Society's programs. As the Great Society aimed to address societal issues, one may ponder its impact on national priorities. Meanwhile, the space race's triumph with Apollo 11 unfolded, but what role did it play in shaping global dynamics? The space race was a 20th century competition between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It began with the announcement of plans to launch artificial satellites in 1955 and reached its peak with the moon race, a competition to land on the moon. The rivalry stemmed from the post-World War II nuclear arms race, and spaceflight capability became a symbol of technological and national superiority. The public's interest in space travel grew after the Soviet Union successfully launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight in 1961 intensified the competition. In response, U.S. President John F. Kennedy set the ambitious goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the 1960s. The U.S. achieved this with the Apollo 11 mission in July 1969, marking what many Americans see as the end of the space race. The Soviet Union faced challenges in its lunar program, leading to a shift in focus toward space stations and exploration of Venus and Mars.
Telemeter indicates that Jet Bane 2 is deflected.
The space race officially concluded with the cooperative Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, where American and Soviet crews docked in Earth orbit. This marked the beginning of space cooperation, further solidified by agreements such as the Shuttle Mir and International Space Station programs after the end of the Cold War. The space race, characterized by groundbreaking achievements and milestones, ultimately transitioned into an era of collaboration in space exploration. As the Apollo 11 mission marked the end of the space race, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution unfolded, drawing the U.S. deeper into Vietnam. What role did these events play in shaping global dynamics? The incident was a pivotal historical moment that increased American involvement in the Vietnam War. It occurred on August 2, 1964, when American forces were conducting covert operations near North Vietnamese waters, prompting a response from North Vietnamese forces. A second incident was reported on August 4th, but subsequent investigations revealed it never happened. It was based on misinterpreted intelligence and skewed communications intercepts from the National Security Agency. During the first encounter, the American destroyer USS Maddox exchanged fire with North Vietnamese torpedo boats, resulting in damage to both sides but no American casualties. The following day, Maddox and another destroyer, USS Turner Joy, believed they were under attack again based on radar readings and communications intercepts. However, there were no actual North Vietnamese boats present. Despite doubts about the validity of the second attack, the Johnson administration used it as justification to escalate American involvement in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed by Congress, gave President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia to counter perceived communist threats. This resolution marked the beginning of extensive American military intervention in Vietnam. The Peace Corps is a U.S. government-run program that sends trained volunteers to help other countries. It started in 1961 when President John F. Kennedy created it. The goal is to assist developing countries by sending skilled Americans to work in education, health, business, women's empowerment, and community development.
Going back immediately with 7,000 strong?
The volunteers are U.S. citizens who usually have a college degree. They undergo 3 months of training and serve at least 2 years in a specific country. After this time, they can choose to extend their service. The Peace Corps encourages volunteers to understand and respect local customs, learn the language, and live like the locals. In the beginning of 1961, there were 900 volunteers in 16 countries. The number of volunteers reached its highest point in 1966, with 15,556 volunteers in 52 countries. However, in 1989, budget cuts reduced the number of volunteers to 5,100.
Determined to send volunteers back into the field once it's safe.
Later on, increased funding allowed the Peace Corps to grow again. By its 50th anniversary in 2011, there were over 8,500 volunteers in 77 countries. Since it started, more than 240,000 Americans have joined the Peace Corps and served in 142 countries. The Peace Corps is important for Americans to contribute to international development and understanding. Another groundbreaking event captured worldwide attention as the Peace Corps blossomed in international aid during the 1960s. In 1967, Christian Barnard achieved the first human heart transplant. Christian Neethling Barnard, born November 8, 1922, was a South African heart surgeon known for performing the world's first successful human-to-human heart transplant in 1967. He transplanted the heart of Denise Darville into Louis Washkansky, who regained consciousness but sadly succumbed to pneumonia 18 days later due to anti-rejection drugs suppressing his immune system. Barnard, originally from Beaufort West, Cape Province, studied medicine in South Africa and gained recognition for developing a life-saving remedy for infant intestinal atresia during his early years as a doctor.
I welcome this opportunity to have a talk to the public.
In 1955, he traveled to the United States, where he encountered the heart-lung machine and worked with open-heart surgery pioneer Walt Lillehei. Returning to South Africa in 1958, Barnard became the head of the Department of Experimental Surgery at Groote Schuur Hospital, Cape Town.
The last 3 years, we've been concentrating on the problems of heart transplantation.
He retired in 1983 due to rheumatoid arthritis, shifting his focus to anti-aging research. However, his reputation suffered when he endorsed Glycel, an anti-aging cream later withdrawn by the FDA. Despite controversies, Barnard dedicated his later years to philanthropy, establishing the Christian Barnard Foundation to aid underprivileged children worldwide. He passed away at the age of 78 in 2001 after suffering from an asthma attack. Barnard's groundbreaking heart transplant and contributions to medical research and child welfare remain significant aspects of his legacy of the 1960s decade.